The porch light flickered over the small, run-down Cleveland rental they called home, illuminating the familiar sight of Magnolia asleep on the faded couch after a long shift at the diner. But the sleek, unmarked cardboard package resting on the kitchen counter, addressed to her, yet containing a velvet box and a receipt paid by a man who wasn't her husband, did not belong in this quiet, working-class life. It was a silent admission of a parallel world, slipping through the cracks of a 10-year marriage. If these fragile, dangerous intersections of love and betrayal resonate with you, stay with me. There are far more secrets hiding behind these thin walls. If you're ready to walk this path, don't leave. The grinding hum of the freight elevator at the logistics warehouse always left a phantom ringing in Aidan Davis's ears, long after his shift ended. At 6 a.m. on a damp Tuesday, the industrial outskirts of Cleveland were painted in shades of wet asphalt and gray exhaust. Aidan parked his beat-up Ford truck in the driveway of the peeling duplex he shared with his wife, Magnolia. His work boots, heavy with grease, and the fatigue of hauling cargo for 10 hours, crunched against the gravel. He craved nothing more than the warmth of his bed and the soft, familiar scent of Magnolia's cheap vanilla shampoo. He unlocked the front door with practiced quietness. Inside, the small living room was perfectly still, illuminated only by the faint, blue glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds. Magnolia was asleep in the bedroom, her waitressing apron tossed carelessly over the back of a dining chair. The apartment smelled of old coffee grounds and the dampness of a home that was never quite warm enough. Aidan set his lunchbox on the cramped kitchen counter. That was when he saw it. It was a sleek, matte black cardboard box, sitting incongruously next to a stack of unpaid utility bills. It looked entirely alien in their home. The shipping label bore their address, with Magnolia James printed clearly at the top. But the return address was a high-end boutique in downtown Chicago, a place miles out of their financial reality. Frowning, Aidan wiped the warehouse grime from his hands with a dish towel. The tape on the box was already sliced open. Magnolia must have checked it before falling asleep, leaving it out in a rare moment of carelessness. He nudged the flaps open. Inside, resting on a bed of crushed black tissue paper, was a velvet jewelry case. Aidan didn't open the case. He didn't need to. Tucked neatly beside it was a heavy stock card, folded in half, and a crumpled receipt that had seemingly fallen out of the envelope. His rough, calloused fingers picked up the receipt first. The Drake Hotel, Chicago, 2 nights. $1,450. Billed to a credit card ending in 4421. The name on the billing address read, Tyler Black. Tyler, the regional supplier who came into the diner twice a month. The man in the sharp suits who always tipped too well and looked at Magnolia a second longer than necessary. Aidan's breath hitched, caught somewhere between his lungs and his throat. The silence of the kitchen suddenly felt deafening, heavy enough to crush him. He picked up the folded card. The handwriting was sharp, arrogant. To my beautiful Maggie, for our weekend in Chicago. Wear this and nothing else. T. The world tilted. 10 years of marriage, of scraping by, of eating boxed mac and cheese so she could afford new nursing shoes for her long shifts on her feet. 10 years of believing they were building a fortress together in a world that wanted to keep them poor. It all evaporated in the sterile, fluorescent light of the kitchen. He looked toward the dark hallway leading to their bedroom. He could hear the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing. A sudden, violent urge to storm into the room, to flip the mattress, to scream until his vocal cords tore, surged through his veins. His hands shook, the edges of the thick card digging into his skin. But Aidan didn't move. Slowly, methodically, the fire in his chest burned out, leaving behind a profound glacial cold. Shouting would give her the chance to lie. It would give her the chance to cry, to beg, to manipulate the narrative into a mistake. Aidan carefully placed the card and the receipt back into the black box, exactly as he had found them. He closed the flaps, aligning the cut tape perfectly. He stepped back, his face devoid of expression. He would not scream. He would not break down. Instead, he would dismantle her world, piece by piece, just as she had effortlessly dismantled his. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the cramped kitchen. Aidan cracked 2 eggs into the cast-iron skillet, the sudden violent sizzle masking the persistent ringing in his ears. It was 7:30 a.m. He had not slept a single minute. The unmarked black cardboard box, along with the velvet case and the damning receipt, was now securely locked inside his heavy steel toolbox in the garage, a temporary tomb for their marriage. Magnolia shuffled into the kitchen a few moments later, wrapped in a faded terry-cloth robe that had seen better days. She rubbed her eyes, the remnants of yesterday's cheap mascara still slightly smudged beneath her lower lashes. "You're up late," she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep, as she reached for the mug of drip coffee Aiden had already poured for her. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his back to her, focusing intently on the stove. He was terrified that if he turned around too quickly, the sheer force of his anger would fracture the air between them. Shift was rough. She took a sip, leaning heavily against the worn laminate counter. She looked beautiful in that exhausted, familiar way. For a decade, that weary posture, that messy bun, had been his anchor. He had worked double shifts in the freezing warehouse just to see her smile at the end of the week. Now, looking at her in his peripheral vision, it was like looking at a meticulously crafted mask. "The diner is killing me," she sighed, massaging the small of her lower back. "Mr. Henderson is talking about changing the supplier again. Says the current meat prices are squeezing our margins tight." "The current supplier." "Tyler Black." Aiden flipped the eggs. The metal spatula scraped harshly against the iron. "That's so? I thought you said the new guy was doing a good job keeping the kitchen stocked." Magnolia didn't miss a beat. She blew on her hot coffee, her eyes fixed lazily on the cracked linoleum floor. "He is. But Henderson is cheap. Anyway, the regional manager is supposedly hosting some vendor training next weekend in Columbus. Henderson wants me to go, since I manage the front-of-house inventory." Columbus. A lie. The heavy stock card in his garage said Chicago. Aiden finally turned to face her, leaning his hips against the cold stove. He looked directly into the eyes of the woman he had promised to protect and provide for when they were barely 20 years old. He searched her face for a flicker of hesitation, a microscopic trace of guilt, a slight tremor in her hands, holding the mug. There was nothing. The lie slipped from her lips as effortlessly as a breath. "Columbus, huh?" Aiden asked mildly, turning back to slide the eggs onto a chipped ceramic plate. "Will Henderson pay for your hotel?" "Yeah, it's fully covered," she said, looking up to meet his gaze. She offered a small, appreciative smile, the exact kind of soft smile meant to reassure a husband who perpetually worried about their dwindling joint bank account. "It'll be nice to sleep in a bed I don't have to make for a couple of days." 2 nights. The Drake Hotel. $1,450. "You deserve a break, Mag," Aiden said smoothly. He walked over and placed the plate on the small dining table. "You worked too hard." She stepped forward, wrapping her free arm around his waist, pressing her cheek against his broad shoulder. Her cheap vanilla shampoo filled his senses, a scent that used to mean home but now felt cloying and synthetic. Aiden stood perfectly still, his large, calloused hands hanging loosely at his sides. He did not pull away, but he did not hold her back. "Thanks, babe," she murmured against his flannel shirt. "I'll pick up some extra shifts this week to make up for being gone." Aiden stared straight over her head at the blank, peeling wall of their kitchen. He felt a profound, hollow detachment settling deep into his bones, freezing the last remnants of his love for her. The woman holding him was a stranger, a ghost inhabiting the shell of his wife. He let her pull back, watched her sit down to eat the breakfast he had dutifully cooked, and silently vowed that by the time she returned from Chicago, there would be nothing left of this life for her to come back to. The logistics center was a cavern of corrugated steel and sodium vapor lights, a place where time was measured not in hours, but in pallets moved and manifests cleared. Aiden navigated the concrete floor with mechanical precision, guiding a forklift loaded with crates of automotive parts. His body executed the grueling labor on autopilot, while his mind remained trapped in the chilling silence of his own kitchen. Through the reinforced glass of the dispatch office, he could see Courtney Hill. She was a fixture at the warehouse, a woman in her late 30s with a sharp jawline, perpetually tired eyes, and a deep-seated cynicism born from dealing with corporate bureaucracy. She sat bathed in the blue glow of her dual monitors, a headset resting around her neck. Courtney handled regional logistics, coordinating with suppliers and vendors across the Midwest. If anyone knew the ecosystem of men like Tyler Black, it was her. Aiden parked the forklift and walked toward the office, the rhythmic thud of his steel-toed boots drowned out by the ambient roar of machinery. He pushed the heavy door open. The climate-controlled air inside was a stark contrast to the humid, exhaust-choked warehouse floor. Courtney didn't look up from her keyboard. "If you're here to complain about the loading dock schedule, Davis, take a number. I'm currently arguing with 3 different freight companies." "Not the schedule," Aiden said, his voice low, steady. He approached her desk, resting his large, grease-stained hands on the edge of the particle board. "I need a favor. Strictly off the clock." Courtney finally paused typing, her eyes flicking up to his face. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the rigid set of his shoulders, the dark circles under his eyes, the absolute absence of his usual easygoing demeanor. "You look like hell, Aiden," she noted dryly, leaning back in her ergonomic chair. "What kind of favor?" "I need you to look into a regional supplier. Food service sector," Aiden said, keeping his gaze locked on the blinking cursor on her screen. "Name is Tyler Black. I think he operates out of a corporate office in Chicago, but he handles accounts in our area. Diners, mostly." Courtney's expression shifted, a subtle tightening around her mouth. She reached for her lukewarm coffee and took a slow sip. "Tyler Black. Yeah, I know the name. Arrogant prick. He used to manage a logistics contract for us a few years back before he jumped ship to Hospitality Supply. He left a trail of screwed-over subcontractors in his wake. Why are you asking about him? You're hauling engine blocks, not frozen burger patties." Aiden looked down at his own hands. The knuckles were white, the skin scarred from years of manual labor. He thought of the velvet box in his garage. He thought of the $1,450 hotel receipt. He thought of his wife's cheap vanilla shampoo and her seamless lies about a training seminar in Columbus. "He's supplying the diner where Magnolia works," Aiden said carefully, rationing his words to prevent his voice from breaking. "I have reason to believe he's mismanaging resources. I need to know how he operates, where he travels, who he reports to." Courtney was silent. The faint hum of the computer tower beneath the desk filled the quiet space between them. She was sharp enough to read the unsaid words, hanging heavily in the air. The tension in Aiden's jaw, the specific, agonizing way he avoided her eyes. It wasn't about misplaced inventory or bad business practices. It was deeply personal. She didn't offer pity. Pity was useless here. Instead, she leaned forward, her fingers resting lightly on the keyboard. "Black is a corporate climber," Courtney said, her tone entirely professional, offering Aiden the dignity of a business transaction. "He uses company expense accounts like a personal slush fund. If he's making a mess in Cleveland, I can guarantee there's a paper trail of travel logs and flagged expenses somewhere in the regional system. It'll take some digging through the vendor portals." "Can you do it?" Aiden asked, finally meeting her eyes. "I can," Courtney replied, a cold, calculating glint in her eyes. "Give me until Thursday. I'll get you everything you need to burn him down." Friday evening arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of an Ohio summer, but inside the cramped bedroom of the duplex, the air felt entirely sterile. A faded canvas suitcase lay open on the center of their matrimonial bed. Aiden stood near the narrow closet, dutifully pulling garments from wire hangers, playing the role of the attentive husband with a mechanical precision that secretly terrified him. "Do you think I need the navy blazer?" Magnolia asked, holding up a cheap polyester jacket she usually reserved for church or bank appointments. She studied her reflection in the cracked full-length mirror attached to the back of the bedroom door. "Mr. Henderson said the vendor dinner on Saturday is business casual, but I don't want to look out of place in Columbus." Aiden looked at the blazer, and then at the woman who had spent the last 72 hours meticulously crafting an alternate reality. Columbus. He knew the corporate headquarters for Tyler Black's hospitality division were in downtown Chicago. He knew the $1,450 reservation at the Drake Hotel began tonight. "Take it just in case," Aiden said smoothly. His voice was a flat, calm lake, perfectly concealing the jagged rocks beneath the surface. Better to have it and not need it. He stepped back and watched her hands as she folded a pair of dark jeans. He noticed the fresh coat of pale pink polish on her fingernails, a luxury she rarely afforded herself on her diner wages. As she turned to grab her toiletry bag, Aiden's eyes caught a glimpse of black fabric near the bottom of the suitcase. A new, lace-trimmed silk camisole was tucked discreetly beneath a stack of plain cotton t-shirts. It was not something a waitress wore to a regional inventory seminar. Every item going into that luggage was a silent confession, a piece of physical evidence he was willingly helping her pack. "You've been so quiet this week, Aid," Magnolia murmured, zipping the canvas luggage closed with a sharp, metallic sound. She turned to face him, a fleeting shadow of concern crossing her features. "Are you sure you're okay with me taking the car for the weekend? I know you hate taking the bus to the warehouse." "I'll manage," he replied, forcing the corners of his mouth to lift into an easy, reassuring smile. The physical effort required to mimic devotion was excruciating, draining the marrow from his bones. "It's just 2 days. You focus on the seminar, make a good impression on the corporate guys." She stepped closer, reaching up to cup his jaw. Her palm felt warm, familiar, and entirely toxic. "I'll call you when I get to the hotel. I love you. Drive safe, Mag," he said, deliberately ignoring the declaration of love. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, a chaste, perfunctory brush of dry lips against her skin. It tasted like ash. Aiden carried her bag out to the rusting sedan idling in the driveway. He watched the red taillights bleed into the encroaching twilight as she drove down the cracked asphalt of their street, heading toward the interstate. He stood on the porch long after the car had turned the corner, the heavy silence of the empty duplex pressing against his back. Once she was truly gone, Aiden walked back inside, bypassed the dark living room, and went straight to the garage. He unlocked his heavy steel toolbox. Beside the black velvet jewelry case lay a cheap, prepaid burner phone and a spiral notebook. He opened the notebook, uncapped a pen, and meticulously wrote down the exact time of her departure, the mileage on the car he had checked that morning, and the hidden silk camisole. The documentation had officially begun. The husband she knew was dead. Only the quiet, patient archivist of her ruin remained. The logistics warehouse was eerily subdued on a Saturday afternoon. The skeleton crew operated the forklifts with a muted rhythm, leaving the vast, corrugated steel building feeling hollow. Inside the dispatch office, the blinds were drawn. The only illumination came from the stark, blue glare of Courtney Hill's dual monitors, reflecting off the rim of her glasses. Aiden stood behind her ergonomic chair, a styrofoam cup of black coffee turning cold in his hand. He watched the screen as Courtney's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing standard vendor firewalls with the ease of someone who had spent a decade navigating flawed corporate intranets. "Tyler Black is a lot of things, but careful isn't one of them," Courtney said, her voice a low, clinical murmur in the quiet room. She clicked a mouse, bringing up a complex spreadsheet filled with transaction codes. "He operates under a regional expense account, meant for client retention and vendor relations. But look at this." She highlighted a series of rows. 3 weeks ago, a charge for $800 at a steakhouse in downtown Cleveland. The memo says it was a dinner with the management of the diner where Magnolia works. Did her boss mention a lavish corporate dinner? "No," Aiden said flatly. His eyes traced the numbers. "Henderson is too cheap to close the diner for a dinner like that. Magnolia told me she was working a double shift that night. She came home smelling like cheap grease and bleach." "She didn't," Courtney corrected gently, pulling up another tab. "Because the receipt itemizes 2 dry-aged ribeyes, a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet, and 2 desserts. It wasn't a management dinner. It was a date, billed to his corporate hospitality fund." Aiden felt a phantom ache in his lower back, a sharp reminder of the crates he had hauled that exact night to afford the new tires on her sedan. While he was bleeding his youth into the concrete floor for $16 an hour, his wife was drinking stolen wine in a booth she could never afford. "There's more," Courtney continued, her tone shifting into something sharper, something resembling professional outrage. "I dug into the inventory logs between Tyler's supply chain and her diner. The numbers don't match. Tyler has been comping premium stock, high-end cuts, specialty goods, and writing them off as promotional samples. The diner is getting top-tier product at bottom-tier prices. He's essentially buying his access to the diner, and to her, using his company's bottom line." Aiden set his coffee cup down. His calloused thumb hovered over the screen of his own smartphone. He opened his banking app, navigating to the joint checking account he shared with Magnolia. For years, he had implicitly trusted her to manage the household budget, depositing his paychecks and taking only a small allowance for gas and lunch. He scrolled through the past 6 months, applying the same forensic lens Courtney was using on the corporate accounts. It was subtle. A $40 ATM withdrawal here, $60 there, cash back at the grocery store checkout. Money siphoned off in microscopic amounts that wouldn't trigger an overdraft, but accumulated into thousands over half a year. It was the phantom budget that paid for the pale pink nail polish, the new perfume, the subtle upgrades to her wardrobe she always claimed were bought from the clearance rack with extra tips. The betrayal was no longer just a physical act in a hotel room in Chicago. It was a sprawling, systemic infection. She had stolen his trust, and she had stolen his sweat. Courtney hit a command on her keyboard, and the heavy laser printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out pages of Tyler's fraudulent expense reports and inventory anomalies. She gathered the warm sheets of paper, stapled them neatly, and handed the thick stack to Aiden. "This is corporate suicide," Courtney said, looking up at him. "If this lands on the desk of the VP of Regional Operations, Tyler Black is finished. He won't just be fired, he'll be blacklisted in the industry." Aiden took the dossier. The weight of it in his hands felt like an anchor. He looked at the printed numbers, feeling the last, lingering threads of his 10-year marriage snap and dissolve into dust. "I don't want him fired yet," Aiden said softly, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I want him to feel safe. Let him take her to Chicago. Let them think they're untouchable." He slipped the folder into his worn canvas backpack. "When the time comes, I'm not just going to burn him down. I'm going to let him take her down with him." The rusted muffler of the sedan rattled as Magnolia killed the engine in the driveway. Sunday evening in Ohio felt heavy, the sky the color of a bruised plum. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel. Her skin still hummed with the memory of high thread count sheets, room service champagne, and the expensive cedarwood scent of Tyler Black. But looking at the peeling paint of the duplex, the fantasy evaporated, replaced by the suffocating weight of her reality. And then there was the missing black box. She had brought it inside Tuesday morning, too exhausted to fully inspect it, before collapsing on the couch. When she woke up, it was gone. She had spent the entire week subtly tearing the living room apart, terrified that Aiden had found it, or worse, that she had absent-mindedly thrown it out. But Aiden had said nothing. He had acted completely normal. She had convinced herself a porch pirate had snatched it from the counter near the open window, a desperate rationalization to keep her fragile double life intact. Magnolia took a deep breath, plastered on a tired but affectionate smile, and pushed the front door open. Aiden was at the kitchen sink, his broad shoulders shifting rhythmically as he scrubbed a cast-iron pan. The television murmured quietly in the background. The scene was aggressively domestic, a portrait of the mundane life she was secretly suffocating in. "Hey," she said softly, dropping her canvas overnight bag by the door. Aiden turned off the faucet. He dried his hands on a towel, turning to face her. There was no rush to greet her, no warm embrace. He simply stood there, his eyes sweeping over her with a calm, detached assessment that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Welcome back," he said. His voice was perfectly even, smooth, hollow. "How was Columbus?" Magnolia swallowed the sudden dryness in her throat. She had rehearsed her lies on the 4-hour drive back from Chicago, but under his steady gaze, the script felt flimsy. "It was exhausting," she lied, moving into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. "A lot of spreadsheets. Inventory forecasting. Mr. Henderson is going to be thrilled, but I'm just glad to be home." She waited for the follow-up questions. "Where did you eat? Who was there? Did you sleep well?" The normal inquiries of a husband who cared. "Good," Aiden said simply. He folded the dish towel and laid it flat on the counter. "You should get some rest before your shift tomorrow." He walked past her, his arm brushing a fraction of an inch from hers. There was no anger radiating from him, no underlying tension she could pinpoint. It was an absence of emotion, a terrifying void where her husband used to be. The calmness was unnatural. It felt like standing in the dead center of a frozen lake, waiting for the ice to crack. Magnolia retreated to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. She leaned against the sink, gripping the porcelain edges as her breathing turned shallow. The guilt, which she usually kept locked in a tight compartment in her mind, began to seep out, mixing with a sudden, inexplicable dread. She turned on the cold water and splashed her face, staring at her own reflection. She was risking everything, betraying the only man who had ever truly loved her when she had nothing. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sharp vibration against her thigh. She pulled it out. Tyler, the Drake feels empty without you. Looking at flights for next month. Maybe Miami this time. Wear the necklace. She stared at the glowing screen. The dread in her stomach warred violently with the sudden, intoxicating rush of dopamine. Miami. Luxury. A life where she didn't have to count quarters for laundry. She typed back a quick reply, "Can't wait," and deleted the thread. She didn't have the necklace, and she didn't have the courage to tell Tyler she lost it. But as she opened the bathroom door to face the eerie silence of her husband's house, Magnolia realized she was walking on a wire, and the net had just been quietly removed. The execution of a man's career, Courtney Hill often mused, rarely happened with a loud crash. It usually sounded like the soft, hollow click of a computer mouse. On Wednesday morning, long before the warehouse floor woke to the roar of forklifts, Courtney sat in the dim dispatch office. An encrypted email, routed through a proxy server to mask its origin, sat open on her screen. Attached were 3 PDF files: the mismatched inventory logs between the Chicago Supply Hub and the Cleveland Diner, the flagged expense reports for luxury dinners, miscategorized as client retention, and the digital footprint of Tyler Black's hotel charges. The recipient was the vice president of corporate compliance for Tyler's hospitality conglomerate. Courtney hovered her cursor over the send button, glanced at the empty doorway, and clicked. The digital bullet was fired. Miles away, the lunch rush at the diner was a suffocating blur of sizzling grease, shouting cooks, and the endless clatter of heavy ceramic plates. Magnolia balanced a tray of club sandwiches on her hip, her cheap nursing shoes slipping slightly on the linoleum behind the counter. She was exhausted, her mind still caught in the suffocating, silent tension of her home. Aiden hadn't asked a single question about Columbus since Sunday. His silence was a physical weight, pressing against her chest. She retreated to the cramped employee break room to grab a breath of air that didn't smell like fryer oil. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. The caller ID flashed Tyler's name. A rush of relief washed over her. She needed his voice. She needed the promise of Miami, of wealth, of an escape from the tightening noose of her reality. "Hey," she answered softly, leaning against the cold metal of the staff lockers. Did Henderson say anything to you?" Tyler interrupted. His voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, arrogant drawl that usually coded his words was gone, replaced by a sharp, breathless panic. Magnolia blinked, startled. "What, Mr. Henderson?" "No, he's in the back office doing payroll." "Tyler, what's wrong?" "Corporate is freezing my regional accounts," Tyler snapped, the sound of hurried footsteps and slamming doors echoing through the receiver. "Compliance just flagged 6 months of inventory audits. They're asking about the comped stock I sent to your diner. They're asking about the steakhouse charges." The small, windowless break room suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. The glamorous illusion of their affair, the high thread count sheets, the expensive wine, the velvet jewelry boxes, shattered in an instant, revealing the ugly mechanics underneath. It was stolen money, and the theft was unraveling. "Tyler," Magnolia whispered, her hand trembling as she gripped the phone. "What does that mean? Are they going to call the diner?" "If they call, you know nothing," he ordered, his tone suddenly harsh, patronizing. He was no longer a lover whispering sweet nothings in a luxury suite. He was a desperate middle manager trying to cover his tracks. "You tell them the invoices match the deliveries. You don't mention the dinners. You don't mention Chicago." "But I manage the front-of-house logs," she stammered, the reality of her complicity crashing down on her. If Henderson looked at the books, he would see the discrepancies. She could lose her job. She could face charges. "If they do an audit here, my name is on the receiving manifests, Tyler." "Then fix it," he hissed. "I spent thousands keeping you entertained, Maggie. Don't be a liability now. Just fix the damn logs before corporate calls Henderson." The line went dead. Magnolia slowly lowered the phone. The dial tone echoed in the sterile silence of the break room. "Kept you entertained. A liability." The words were corrosive, burning away the last shreds of her romanticized fantasy. She looked down at her pale pink nail polish, paid for with money skimmed from Aiden's meager paycheck, and realized with a sickening clarity that she had traded the unwavering loyalty of a good man for the crumbling facade of a thief. And worse, the ground beneath her was giving way, and there was absolutely no one left to catch her. The interior of the First Fidelity branch on Elm Street smelled of stale commercial carpet and industrial lemon cleaner. It was Thursday morning, a rare day off for Aiden, and the bank was mostly empty, save for a few retirees cashing pension checks. He sat in a vinyl chair opposite a loan officer's desk, staring blankly at the frosted glass partition. 10 years ago, he and Magnolia had sat at this exact desk to open their joint checking account. They had exactly $400 to their names, but she had gripped his hand under the table, her eyes bright with the naive, fierce belief that they were building an empire. Now, the memory tasted like ash. Mr. Davis, the branch manager, a tired-looking man with a fading hairline, returned to his desk holding a stack of printed forms. "I have the paperwork ready to sever the joint accounts. As requested, I've transferred exactly 50% of the current balance into your new, individual checking account. The direct deposit authorization for your employer has also been rerouted." "And the credit cards?" Aiden asked, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You've been removed as the primary guarantor on the visa," the manager confirmed, sliding a blue pen across the laminate desk. "Any new charges made on the card carrying Mrs. Davis's name will fall entirely under her liability. Since her declared income from the diner is below the threshold, her limit will be drastically reduced within the next billing cycle. Are you certain you want to proceed without notifying her?" "Yes," Aiden said. He picked up the pen. He didn't hesitate. With 3 swift, jagged signatures, he amputated a decade of shared survival. It was a profoundly quiet violence. There were no screaming matches, no shattered plates in the kitchen. There was only the dry scratch of a ballpoint pen on paper, officially rendering Magnolia a stranger to his livelihood. He walked out into the gray Ohio morning, the damp air cooling the sweat on his neck. He was free, but he felt only a hollow, echoing emptiness. Miles away, the lunch rush at the diner had devolved into a nightmare. Magnolia stood by the POS terminal, her hands shaking so violently she dropped a handful of coins onto the sticky linoleum. Mr. Henderson had been in his cramped back office all morning, tearing through the past year's inventory binders. Twice, she had seen him on the phone, his face flushed red, yelling about missing meat shipments and fraudulent vendor codes. Tyler was gone. He had not answered her texts since yesterday's panicked phone call. His number now went straight to an automated voicemail. The man who had promised her Miami sunsets and silk sheets had vanished into the corporate ether the second his own neck was on the line. She needed to go home. She needed Aiden. The realization hit her with a sickening wave of hypocrisy. In her darkest, most terrified moment, her instinct was to run back to the steady, unglamorous husband she had been happily deceiving just a week prior. When Magnolia finally pushed through the front door of the duplex that evening, the house was dark. Aiden was sitting at the small kitchen table, bathed in the dim, amber light of the stove hood. He was eating a bowl of canned soup, his posture rigid. "Aiden," she gasped, dropping her purse on the counter. The exhaustion and fear finally broke her. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. "I had the worst day. Henderson is going crazy at work. They're talking about an audit, and I just feel so sick." She stepped toward him, desperate for him to stand up, to pull her into his broad chest, to tell her that he would protect her from the storm gathering outside. Aiden slowly lowered his spoon. He looked up at her, his eyes dark, unreadable, and entirely devoid of the warmth that had sustained her for 10 years. He saw the panic in her trembling shoulders. He knew about the audit. He knew about Tyler's silence. And he knew that the debit card sitting in her purse was now tethered to an empty ghost of an account. "Eat something, Mag," Aiden said softly, his voice perfectly even. "You look like you're going to collapse." He didn't stand up. He didn't reach for her. He just went back to his soup, leaving her standing in the middle of the kitchen, entirely alone, completely unaware that the floor beneath her had already been removed. The fluorescent bulb in Mr. Henderson's back office had flickered for 3 years, but on Friday morning, its erratic buzzing sounded like a countdown. Magnolia stood awkwardly by the dented filing cabinet, her diner uniform smelling faintly of maple syrup and the stale grease of the fryer. Across from her sat Henderson, his face flushed a dangerous shade of magenta, and a woman in a sharp, charcoal gray suit who had introduced herself as Sarah Vance, corporate compliance for Tyler's hospitality group. Vance didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she slid a thick manila folder across Henderson's cluttered desk. "We've spent the last 48 hours auditing the regional supply lines," Vance began, her voice possessing the sterile, unforgiving chill of an operating room. "The discrepancies between the Chicago hub and this diner amount to nearly $20,000 in misallocated premium stock over 6 months. Furthermore, there are significant irregularities involving regional hospitality funds." Magnolia's heart slammed against her ribs. She gripped the seams of her apron, her palms damp with a cold, terrifying sweat. She had barely slept. Aiden had been a ghost in their home, moving around her with a polite, devastating indifference that offered absolutely no sanctuary. "I don't understand," Henderson stammered, wiping his brow with a paper napkin. "We pay our invoices. Magnolia handles the receiving logs. They match. They match because they were doctored," Vance stated flatly. She pulled a printed email from the folder and turned it to face Magnolia. "When confronted yesterday, Mr. Black provided a sworn statement to our legal department. He claims that the inventory manipulation was a localized scheme initiated by your front-of-house manager, Miss James." The small office seemed to tilt violently. Magnolia stared at the paper. The words swam before her eyes, but the signature at the bottom was clear, arrogant, and entirely familiar. Tyler Black. He stated that Miss James threatened to sabotage the diner's regional contract unless she received personal kickbacks in the form of premium goods and, quote, extorted hospitality expenses, which she demanded be categorized as vendor retention. Vance's eyes, devoid of any pity, locked onto Magnolia. Mr. Black admits to a grave lapse in professional judgment by capitulating to these demands, but he maintains he was operating under duress to protect a lucrative corporate account. Extorted. The word struck her like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs. The man who had bought her a weekend at the Drake, who had kissed her collarbone and promised her Miami sunsets, had legally classified her as a thief to save his own 6-figure salary. He had weaponized her poverty, using her low-wage position as the perfect, disposable scapegoat for his own embezzlement. "That's a lie," Magnolia whispered. Her voice was thin, frail, shattering in the suffocating air of the room. He bought those things. He took me to the steakhouse. I didn't force him to do anything." Vance raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, her pen pausing over her legal pad. "So, you admit to accepting lavish personal gifts and dinners funded by stolen corporate capital?" Magnolia froze. The trap had snapped shut. Tyler hadn't just thrown her under the bus. He had meticulously chained her to the tracks. "I want her out of my diner," Henderson barked, the betrayal transforming his usual gruffness into raw, shaking fury. "Turn in your apron, Magnolia. You're fired. And if these corporate people decide to press charges, I'm cooperating fully. I won't let you drag my life's work down with your trash." 10 minutes later, Magnolia found herself standing in the scorching asphalt parking lot. The midday sun was blinding, offering no warmth to the ice flooding her veins. She had no job. She had a looming threat of a corporate lawsuit. Her hands shook violently as she pulled out her phone and dialed Tyler's number one last time. "The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." He had changed his number. He was a ghost. The grand, intoxicating affair had been reduced to a severed connection and a cardboard box of personal belongings sitting by her cheap nursing shoes. She looked down at her hands, at the pale pink nail polish she could no longer afford, and realized the agonizing truth. Tyler Black had never loved her. He had simply rented her, and when the bill came due, he left her to pay the debt alone. The drive back to the duplex was a blur of sun-bleached asphalt and blinding panic. The needle on the sedan's dashboard hovered dangerously over the red E, forcing Magnolia to pull into a decaying gas station just off the interstate. Her hands shook as she slid her debit card into the reader at the pump. She stared at the digital screen, silently begging for a momentary reprieve from the nightmare her day had become. Declined. "Please see cashier." She blinked, wiping a bead of sweat from her temple. She tried again. Declined. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She opened her banking app, her thumb trembling over the cracked screen. The screen loaded, displaying her account summary. The joint checking account, the one holding their meager savings, the safety net Aiden had built with thousands of hours of graveyard shifts, was gone. In place was an individual account in her name only. The balance was $12.40. Her credit line had been slashed to zero. Aiden. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He knew. The unnatural calmness, the missing black box, the cold, detached way he had watched her pack for Columbus. It wasn't ignorance. It was a countdown. She abandoned the car at the pump and practically ran the last 4 blocks to their neighborhood, her cheap nursing shoes slapping loudly against the concrete sidewalks. She didn't care about the heat, or the curious stares from the neighbors watering their lawns. She needed to get home. She needed to look into his eyes, to fall to her knees and beg for the mercy she absolutely did not deserve. He was a good man. If she cried, if she explained how Tyler had manipulated her, maybe there was a fragment of the boy who had promised to love her left in that house. Magnolia shoved her key into the front door of the duplex, twisting it violently. The door swung open, hitting the interior wall with a dull thud. "Aiden!" she gasped, her voice cracking as she stumbled into the dim living room. The house was profoundly, aggressively silent. The rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator was the only sound greeting her. The air felt stale, entirely devoid of the familiar scent of his coffee and the faint, metallic tang of the warehouse. She hurried down the narrow hallway to their bedroom. She threw open the closet doors. The left side, where Aiden kept his flannel shirts and heavy denim, was stripped bare. Only a row of empty wire hangers remained, pushed together in a tangled metallic clump. His heavy work boots were missing from the corner. Panic rising like bile in her throat, she moved to the bathroom. The medicine cabinet was open. His razor, his shaving cream, his toothbrush, all gone. Even his worn blue towel was missing from the rack. She ran to the kitchen, yanking open drawers and cabinets. His favorite ceramic mug, his lunchbox, his thermos, erased. Magnolia slowly backed out of the kitchen, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She stepped into the living room and looked around. The furniture was still there. The television still sat on the cheap composite stand. But the life they had built together had been surgically removed. She walked over to the small wooden table by the front door, where they usually tossed their keys and mail. There was no dramatic, tear-stained letter waiting for her. There was no angry note, no demand for an explanation, no final declaration of a broken heart. Aiden had simply packed his life into boxes while she was sleeping next to him, slipping out the door without making a sound. Magnolia sank onto the faded couch, the cheap fabric scratching against the back of her legs. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. The silence of the empty house pressed down on her, heavier than concrete. She had spent months trying to escape the mundane, suffocating reality of this duplex. Now, as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the peeling linoleum, she realized she had finally succeeded. She had absolutely nothing left. The text message had contained only an address and a time: Henderson's Diner, 2:00 p.m. It was a calculated cruelty, choosing the exact location of her public, professional execution. But Magnolia had no leverage left to negotiate. She walked through the glass doors, the familiar bell chiming overhead, and immediately felt the burning stares of her former co-workers. The smell of fryer grease and burnt coffee, once a symbol of her suffocating routine, now felt like the scent of a graveyard. Aiden was sitting in a corner booth, the very booth where Tyler used to sit and leave $100 tips. He wore his heavy denim jacket, his posture relaxed but entirely inaccessible. He was staring out the window at the gray Ohio traffic, nursing a mug of black coffee. Magnolia slid into the opposite side of the booth. The red vinyl squeaked under her weight. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to fold them in her lap to hide the chipped, pale pink polish. "Aiden," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper against the clatter of silverware and the low hum of the midday rush. He turned his head slowly. His eyes traced her face, taking in the dark circles, the pale skin, the sheer exhaustion radiating from her bones. But there was no pity in his gaze. There was no anger either. It was the terrifying, absolute emptiness of a man looking at a stranger. He didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila folder, placing it squarely in the center of the sticky laminate table. Magnolia stared at the folder, her throat tightened. She reached out with shaking fingers and flipped the cover open. On top was the formal petition for dissolution of marriage. Underneath it was a printed spreadsheet detailing the exact dates, times, and amounts of every dollar she had siphoned from their joint account over the last 6 months. And resting perfectly in the center of the documents, heavy and damning, was the matte black velvet jewelry box. The air rushed out of her lungs. He had known. He had the box the entire time. "You knew!" she choked out, a hot tear finally spilling over her lashes and dropping onto the legal paperwork. "When I packed for Columbus, when I came home, you knew." "The receipt for the Drake Hotel was inside the shipping box," Aiden said. His voice was an even, low baritone, completely devoid of tremor or heat. $1,450. For a man who fired you to save his own corporate expense account. Magnolia squeezed her eyes shut. The shame was a physical weight, crushing her ribs, suffocating her. "I'm so sorry, Aiden. I was so tired of this life. I thought he was an escape. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to get caught, Mag," Aiden corrected quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You wanted the hotel in Chicago, and you wanted the husband who worked the night shift to pay for your groceries when you got back. You wanted both." "Please," she sobbed, the sound muffled by her hands as she buried her face in her palms. "I have nothing. He blocked my number. Henderson is threatening to call the police. I have $12 to my name. Please, Aid." Aiden watched her cry. A year ago, a single tear from her would have sent him into a panic, ready to burn the world down to protect her. Now, he felt only the dull ache of a phantom limb. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a $5 bill, and slid it under his coffee mug to cover the check. "Sign the papers by Monday," Aiden said, standing up from the booth. He looked down at her one last time, the ghost of his 10-year marriage flickering and dying in the harsh fluorescent light of the diner. "And leave the house keys on the kitchen counter when you pack. The lease is in my name now." He turned and walked toward the exit. Magnolia sat alone in the corner booth, weeping over the velvet box, surrounded by the deafening noise of the life she had casually thrown away. Monday morning arrived with a biting, unseasonable chill that seeped through the thin walls of the Ohio duplex. Inside the bedroom, Magnolia wrestled with the zipper of her faded canvas suitcase. It was the exact same piece of luggage she had meticulously packed for Chicago just 10 days ago, hiding a lace-trimmed silk camisole beneath her plain cotton shirts. Now, it held nothing but cheap diner uniforms she no longer needed, heavy sweaters, and the crushing weight of a life entirely undone. The apartment was suffocating in its stillness. Without Aiden's heavy boots thudding against the floorboards, without the smell of his dark roast coffee brewing in the kitchen, the space was just an empty box of peeling paint and scuffed linoleum. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a crime scene. Magnolia walked into the kitchen, her cheap nursing shoes scuffing against the floor. She carried 2 items in her hands. The first was the thick manila folder containing the signed dissolution of marriage. She had spent Sunday night crying over the dotted lines, her tears warping the crisp legal paper, desperately hoping the phone would ring. It never did. Tyler Black remained a ghost in the corporate machine, and Aiden Davis was a phantom who had successfully amputated her from his existence. The second item was the matte black velvet box. She set the manila folder on the small laminate dining table. Next to it, she placed the jewelry box. She didn't open it to look at the necklace. The velvet felt repulsive against her skin, a physical manifestation of the vanity and greed that had cost her everything. Tyler had used her poverty to shield his own crimes, and she had willingly handed him the weapon because he promised her a hotel room with a view. Magnolia reached into her pocket and pulled out her house key. It was attached to a cheap plastic keychain Aiden had won for her at a county fair years ago. Her thumb traced the worn plastic one last time before she unhooked the metal ring. The key hit the countertop with a sharp, solitary clink. It was the final sound of a 10-year marriage. Magnolia picked up her canvas bag, opened the front door, and stepped out into the damp, gray morning. She had nowhere to go, no paycheck waiting, and an empty bank account. She walked down the cracked driveway, leaving the door unlocked behind her, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving anonymity of the neighborhood. 30 miles west, the rusted muffler of a Ford truck rattled steadily against the asphalt of the interstate. Aiden Davis kept his hands 10 and 2 on the worn leather steering wheel. The bed of his truck held exactly 4 cardboard boxes and a heavy steel toolbox. A decade of his life, compressed into the back of a pickup. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The industrial skyline of Cleveland, the towering exhaust stacks, the sprawling logistics warehouses, the faint, smog-choked outline of the city limits, was rapidly shrinking into the distance. There was no triumphant smile on his face. Revenge, he had learned, was a deeply sterile endeavor. It did not heal the wound, it merely cauterized it, leaving behind a thick, permanent scar. He thought of the empty duplex. He thought of the manila folder waiting on the table. He felt a dull, phantom ache in his chest for the girl who used to smell like cheap vanilla shampoo, the girl he had promised to build a fortress for. But as the truck accelerated, merging onto the open highway leading toward the state line, the oppressive weight that had been crushing his lungs for 2 weeks finally began to lift. The air filtering through the cracked window was freezing, biting at his cheeks, but it was incredibly clean. Aiden shifted gears, his heavy work boots pressing down on the pedal. He didn't know where he was going to sleep tonight, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't care. He was finally awake, driving away from the ashes of a stolen life, straight into the cold, blinding light of a brand new day.